Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
Have you ever closely inspected the landscape when you're touring the national park system, particularly in the West? You never know what you might find. Back in 2010, a 7-year-old attending a junior ranger program at Badlands National Park spied a partially exposed fossil that turned out to be the skull of a 32-million-year-old saber-toothed cat. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. I've never been that lucky, but there was the time on a river trip through Cataract Canyon in Canyonlands National Park when I spotted a fossilized dinosaur trackway on a slab of sandstone. And if you've ever visited Petrified Forest National Park, you've no doubt marveled over the colorful fossilized tree trunks there. There also are fossilized trees on the northern range of Yellowstone National Park, but nowhere near as colorful. For this week's show, we've invited Vince Santucci, the National Park Service's senior paleontologist, to discuss the many fossil resources that exist across the national park system from coast to coast. We'll be back in a minute with Vince.
Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. National Parks Traveler has launched the National Parks RVing Guide, the definitive guide for RVers seeking information on campgrounds in the National Park system. The guide is now available free through the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store. If you're a traveler who wants to explore the National Park system, you'll want this app. The guide is packed with details for campgrounds in more than 70 national parks across the country, searchable by park, state, or region. You'll also find feeds of the traveler's content, including our latest stories and podcasts. Download the National Parks RVing Guide and start planning your next trip today.
Welcome to the Traveler, Vince. It's great to catch up.
Yeah, that was a great introduction. Thanks very much. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you.
Oh, it's a fascinating subject. Any type of science in the parks is a fascinating subject to me. I really enjoy it. But when you're talking about science and history and how they dovetail together, it really does get fascinating. Now, before we really get down into it, how many parks have fossil resources? I mean, there's, I think, 429 units of the National Park System. How many of them do we know have fossil resources in them?
So currently, we've documented fossils in 286 different units of the National Park Service. That has grown since the beginning of this effort to try to understand the broad scope of fossils across the National Park System, which we started in 1985, and a list of 12 parks.
12 parks. Now, when you're talking 286 parks have fossil resources, what type of resources are we talking about? I mean, people think about fossils and they think about Jurassic Park and huge T-Rexes and whatnot. I guess they span all sizes and types.
Yeah, we think that the National Park Service preserves a really good example of America's paleontological heritage, spanning from some of the earliest known life forms, these algal mats that are preserved high in the Rocky Mountains at Glacier National Park. They're well over 1 billion years old, and they span all the way through Pleistocene, Holocene cave fossils in Grand Canyon, Guadalupe Mountains, and elsewhere that preserve these Ice Age animals that some lived and died and are preserved within these caves.
Yeah, we're going to get into Grand Canyon. I wasn't aware that Guadalupe Mountains had fossils.
Tremendous. And there are two sources of fossils that stand out when you mention Guadalupe Mountains, and that would be the Permian age marine invertebrates that are preserved within the limestones that form that big Guadalupe Mountain reef complex. Occasionally there's some fish and shark's teeth preserved within as well. But because it's a limestone geologic unit, that it's filled with caves. That's why Carlsbad Caverns is there. And there are hundreds of caves, some of which preserve a extraordinary collection of ice age and more recent remains of mammals and birds and things like that.
Yeah. Now it's interesting. The Park Service even has a web page that lists all the parks that have fossil resources. If you want to find a park nearby you, perhaps, or if you're going on vacation, you can check that page and find out what parks have fossil resources, and even, I believe, what sort of fossils were found there.
Exactly. And our ability to work with park staff, we do a lot of baseline inventories to try to identify the different types of fossils that occur in the parks that, park rangers want to know everything there is to know about their park. So when we tell them there's fossils there, they become our great advocates and want to share that information responsibly with the public, along with a resource stewardship message about how they shouldn't be taking these fossils home as souvenirs when they leave the park.
Right, right. Now, paleontologists in the National Park Service, you're the senior paleontologist. I don't think you have very many paleontologists across the system to help you, do you?
Boy, we need a lot of help. And we're fortunate to have good partners in the scientific community that provide us a lot of support, a lot of young students in paleontology that are looking for experience. But we have currently 12 paleontologists working to support our efforts across the agency. Most of those are based in a park, so at Petrified Forest National Park, at Badlands National Park, John Day Fossil Beds in Oregon, have paleontology staff. A lot of their work is focusing on the fossils within the boundaries of that park. Occasionally, we can get some help where they can come out and venture and provide us support in one of the adjacent parks that needs some assistance.
Yeah. Now, back in 1998, I believe it was, you had published a paleontological survey of Yellowstone National Park. 429 units in the National Park System. How many of them have been able to conduct paleontological surveys to see what's out there?
So we've done two types of inventories. We did initial literature reviews looking to see what kinds of fossil specimens from parks are in museum collections. And so between 2002 and 2012, we did these literature reviews and museum collection reviews for all of the units of the National Park Service. And boy, we really grew fast in terms of the number of parks that we had documented fossils through that effort. During that effort, we realized that, boy, we need to get out there in the field too and do field based inventories because in many park areas, there hasn't been that kind of field activities to document the resources. And so once we completed all of the literature reviews and museum collection reviews, we started on these ventures to go out and target parks to do more field based inventories. We've done those in about 3 dozen parks. I have to say that in almost every case, when we're out there, we're making discoveries to document new occurrences of fossils that had not been known previously, particularly from within that park. And then there are many cases where we're finding things that are brand new to science. At Mammoth Cave National Park, when we went in there, we knew that there were some Ice Age fossils there, and we knew that there were some Mississippian age, very primitive Paleozoic marine invertebrates that were preserved, but they were never really studied well. And so through that process, we've encountered all these wonderful fish and mostly sharks. In fact, we have at least 70 to 80 different species of sharks that are documented from these Mississippian limestones at Mammoth Cave. One of the richest occurrences of these kinds of life forms anywhere. And currently, we are describing six new to science species of sharks from Mammoth Cave, which, if we didn't do these inventories, they would have still remained unknown.
And it's actually a great reminder that once upon a time, ocean covered a lot of the North American continent. And, when you go to Mammoth Cave, you go down underground and you think you're just walking through a block of rock, if you will. And you're actually walking across what used to be, underwater. So it is really fascinating and brings another facet of the national park system to light when you discover these types of things and be able to tell the stories. Now, you mentioned you did a bunch of museum research or studies to see what's out there, what might have come from parklands. The Park Service, of course, dates back to 1916 when it was created by Congress. And of course, there were the Bone Wars before that in the late 1800s, 1890s, I believe, when the Yale professors and Harvard professors went out west to see what they could find. Were any large fossils taken from today's parklands back then that have showed up in national museums? I mean, you wonder about the T-Rexes and the brontosaurs and whatnot. What can you tell us about what are in those museum collections that might have come from parklands?
Why we feel that our jobs are some of the most exciting jobs anywhere is because there's a lot of discovery. And it's not just the scientific discoveries we're making of these fossils in parks, but the history, the rich history associated with the discoveries and collections. And so many of the collections of fossils that we found in museums were collected prior to that area becoming a national park. And so being able to connect the dots in that way, that these rich stories of fossil discoveries made in the American West really have enhanced these wonderful stories that have both a historic context, the human dimensions to them, as well as the scientific information that's associated with these ancient life forms.
Of course, South Dakota has been pretty much in the news when you talk about some of the big T-Rex fossils and whatnot.
Yes.
North Dakota, I'm guessing, is the same. We don't run across fossils of those sizes in the parks these days, do we?
Oh, we do. And we're finding them all over, and including in Alaska. There's been some really tremendous discoveries over the past 20 years in Alaska national parks, where in these very remote areas, scientists are getting out and they're doing baseline inventories and they're documenting some of the largest fossil dinosaur tracks in North America at these very high latitudes that no one really predicted that they would find dinosaur remains that far north.
It really is surprising where they're turning up. As I mentioned in the introduction of today's show, the fossil resources in the park system stretch from coast to coast, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Would you say that Channel Islands National Park off the coast of California is one of the most unusual parks to reveal fossils? I mean, I know researchers there have found the fossilized remains of a sea cow, as well as a prehistoric mammoth skull, and those two finds seem contradictory. One's a land dweller and the other's a sea creature.
Yeah, one of the many very rich stories that the Park Service preserves regarding the fossil record. So, one of the stories that's tied to Channel Islands that we find most interesting, and so do the public, is that there are occurrences of what are called pygmy mammoths. They're dwarf sized mammoths that are found preserved at Channel Island. And during the ice ages, when sea levels were lower, that apparently there was the ability for some of the mammoths that were on the mainland on the western coast of North America to be able to swim across and get on the island. And of course, there were no predators on the islands at that time. And so they survived there. And there are generations of these organisms. And over time, one of those interesting phenomena that we see in the fossil record is that these very large animals don't necessarily have the abundance of food to exist and carry their large mass. And so over time, generation after generation, we find that the skeletons become smaller. And so by the late Pleistocene, we have the remains of dwarfed pygmy mammoths that have been discovered, collected, and studied from Channel Islands National Park. And of course, they went extinct as well as other mammoths at the end of the Ice Age. But it's a really unique story of island biogeography and how it may impact organisms living in those environments based on the fact that there were no predators that selected for them to maybe stay big because it was safer to be an enormous animal.
Yeah. And when you say dwarf mammoth, a little oxymoron there, how tall might they have been or how small might they have been?
So, just a couple of meters tall as an adult mammoth. The skeletons are adorable, and they look very much like the same morphological features, some variations from the traditional mammoths, but they're much smaller. And of course, the big Columbian mammoths and some of the other mammoths were some of the largest land mammals that ever existed. So to have these companion mini versions of the mammoths are quite novel and are of great interest both to the scientific community and the public.
Yeah, and I guess if folks wanted to see a mammoth skeleton, fossilized remains, they would go down to Texas and Waco Mammoth National Monument.
If you go to one of the really famous Ice Age fossil sites in California, Rancho La Brea, the La Brea tar pits, they have skeletons of some of the organisms that were collected there. They also have a diorama or a life size reconstruction of a pygmy mammoth on display at the visitor center.
Interesting. Is it side by side with a Columbian mammoth?
Not necessarily side by side, but close enough that you can make those dimensional observations.
Interesting. Now, Vince, is it safe to say that Dinosaur National Monument is the most famous park site associated with the fossilized past? Thanks to that dinosaur bone-studded hillside, or is that just because I'm in Utah and dinosaurs not too far away?
So I think you're probably right. I would say that probably more Americans or even visitors from around the world may recognize Dinosaur National Monument as one of the paleontological icons. But I think that's an artifact of our society in general. In that, I think we when we say the word fossil, people synonymize the word dinosaur right away, and that comes to mind. And I think that the movies like Jurassic Park have helped to promote that very sensational monster-like animal that stimulates the imagination of most visitors. But Petrified Forest is world renowned. Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona is a world renowned site. Visitors from around the world, particularly Europe, like to come and visit Petrified Forest. So, it's fairly well known as well. But I do think that dinosaur, just by the name, attracts great interest and has its own identity amongst the other fossil parks.
Right. At the same time, you scroll through the list of national park sites and fossils show up quite frequently. There's Fossil Butte National Monument in Wyoming, of course, Tule Springs Fossil Beds National Monument near Las Vegas, one of the newest national monuments. John Day Fossil Beds, as you mentioned, Agate Fossil Beds National Monument in Nebraska. I got a chance a year ago to visit that. Pretty interesting place. And then Fluorescent Fossil Beds. So there really is a rich collection of park units where you can find fossils or learn about fossil history of different sorts of different eras and different epochs.
They're absolutely. And I think what also is amazing is that those parks that you would never think is a park that's going to have fossils has surprised us. So, for example, I live in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and here we have, one of the most important Civil War battlefield sites, Gettysburg National Military Park. And so during the 1930s, when the Civilian Conservation Corps was helping to develop the battlefield, they were going to construct a small bridge over Plum Run along South Confederate Avenue. And the Civilian Conservation Corps helped with the quarrying and the construction of this stone bridge. During the quarrying activities, they were getting rock to be able to put into the bridge, and they were finding fossil footprints, dinosaur tracks, and other vertebrate remains. And so as a result, it led to great discussion amongst the paleontologists from the Smithsonian, from Penn State University, Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, even the Pennsylvania State Museum. And when they all confirmed that, yeah, these are all legitimate fossil footprints, that the museums took some of the best specimens. But the suggestion to the park superintendent is, why don't we put some in the stone wall? And if you visit the park today, along the capstone of this stone bridge on both sides of the bridge, you can see some of these Triassic age, about 205, 210 million year old footprints of dinosaurs. And when I take school kids out there or other visitors, I often like to round up the discussion by saying, long before the footsteps of Union and Confederate soldiers marched across the battlefield at Gettysburg, dinosaurs left their footprints in mud. And I think people like that sort of thing.
No, absolutely. It really really gives you some perspective on how the landscape has changed over the millennia. Now, as I was preparing for our conversation talking about unusual sites where you have fossils, I discovered that there's even a protocol for paleontological resource monitoring at George Washington Birthplace National Monument in Virginia. What fossils did you find there?
So along the Atlantic coast, there are areas, particularly in the mid-Atlantic, that have some of these marine deposits that are just loaded with the remains of whales and dolphins and shark's teeth, Calvert Cliffs, which is a very famous locality along the shorelines in Virginia. That it's an area that is world renowned for the abundance of all these shark's teeth that are eroding out of these marine sediments. George Washington Birthplace has those same sorts of sediments, and we got called by the park staff at some point when they started recognizing that because of all the hurricane activity and storms, that these fossiliferous cliffs were eroding back very, very rapidly. And they wanted to figure out, are we losing important resources that we don't understand because we're not documenting them? And so we had offered to come in and work on a project to do periodic monitoring, to go back there on a regular basis and go along the cliffs and try to determine if there's anything there. And so it's been very successful, and we've been rewarded through this initial effort of establishing the protocols on how we want to be able to document on a regular basis. So it might be that we come out there after a big hurricane or storm, knowing that there's going to probably be new exposures of fossil material. But we had one of the law enforcement rangers who just fell in love with this project, and he would go out regularly on his kayak right along the cliffs. And, he'd call us or send us an email and send a picture once in a while. And I'll never forget the day that he sent us some photos where what he was showing us in the photo looked like the end of the beak of a Miocene age long-nosed dolphin. And so I
Hmm.
sent it to some experts at the Calvert Marine Museum, and they got really excited and said, "Hey, that's probably a long-nosed dolphin." And so we made arrangements, and this was like the first weeks of COVID, so we had to get special permission to go out there. But we brought a team out, and they were able to uncover what turned out to be the complete skull of one of these very rare marine dolphins that we were able to collect. And fortunately, on our way back go back to our cars, a second dolphin skull was discovered and collected the same day. So that's a world's record, by the way. Two dolphin skulls in one day, and it's all based on the good work of an observant law enforcement ranger that followed all the rules and reported on this important find.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Really incredible. Now, talking about shark's teeth, I mean, you think about a shark's tooth and, maybe an inch long, inch and a half long, 2 inches long. A couple years ago, I believe it was, at Cape Lookout National Seashore, somebody found a shark's tooth that was bigger than your fist, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. Some of these ancient sharks were much larger than modern sharks. I mean, they were whale size, and the megalodon is one that probably is most known by third graders that are familiar with these fossils that occur along the Atlantic coast.
Yeah. Now, of course, where there are fossils, some folks see dollar signs or collectibles. And that was the case with a unit of the park system that is no longer part of the park system, Fossil Cycad National Monument. What can you tell us about that story?
Yeah, it's an unfortunate story about a National Park Service unit that was established in 1922 under the authority of the Antiquities Act. President Harding preserved this area that had this very rich fossil plant deposits. Cycads are plants. They sort of look like a pineapple. And so this area in the southern Black Hills that preserved these cycad deposits were being studied by the Smithsonian and some other specialists who studied fossil plants. And they were they were just so excited about the fact that Dinosaur National Monument was preserved just a few years earlier that they felt that they wanted to get a fossil plant locality preserved, and they felt that this was a really good one. Unfortunately, during the 20s and then into the 30s, after during the Depression, et cetera, that the Park Service didn't invest a lot of time or money in developing fossil cycad. And so if you build it, they will come. And based on a number of unfortunate circumstances, it was determined by the mid 1930s that all of the fossils that had occurred and were exposed at the surface were removed. And they were not removed under permit. They were taken from the site. And so by the time that we got through the Second World War and we were heading into the Cold War, there was a real interest in looking for uranium minerals. And so, because the site was depleted of the resource, the fossil cycads, that was, why the area was originally set aside as a national monument. Because those resources were gone, the interest in being able to explore the area for uranium minerals became a precedent in the Department of Interior. And so, what had happened only a few times in the history of the national park system is that Congress voted a piece of legislation to abolish or deauthorize Fossil Cycad National Monument. And the sad part about it is that the area that once scientists stood in awe, that had the potential to be another park to provide public opportunities to learn about these very ancient life forms, that today the area is an area where cows quietly graze on BLM administered lands.
Now we say, of course, the only thing you should take from national parks are photographs, and the only thing you should leave are footprints. Back in 1970, I believe it was, a young child, maybe 5 years old, left Petrified Forest National Park with a piece of petrified wood, and later sent it back with a note apologizing for that behavior.
Yeah, Petrified Forest National Park is one of those areas that has had a history of people going there and souvenir collecting. In fact, in the 90s, when I had worked there as the paleontologist, we were able to bring in some social scientists that did natural resource kinds of social science for Virginia Tech University. And they looked at trying to understand visitor attitudes, perspectives, and motivations relative to their behaviors during their visit at Petrified Forest National Park. And so they would do interviews with individuals, particularly those that were observed collecting pieces of petrified wood. They were given amnesty to find out, what was it that generated their interest in doing something that wasn't appropriate in the national park, despite the fact that there are signs everywhere that they're not supposed to remove or collect any of these resources. Some of the responses are really interesting. Some people say that, oh, well, grandpa and grandma have a piece of petrified wood on their mantle, and mom and dad have a piece from when they visited. And now it's our turn to bring our children and collect our souvenir as part of a family tradition. But I think the park has done a remarkably good job in educational outreach. And I think that, Bill Parker and the other staff at Petrified Forest have really been able to promote stewardship values and in the public to deter that kind of activity from going on. I'm sure it still occurs occasionally, but I think that the public education aspect of all of this is a really important and compelling discussion when it comes to non-renewable resources like petrified wood or dinosaur remains.
Yeah. Once years ago, I was in Yellowstone National Park for a story, and a colleague of mine, we hiked up this hillside. Maybe it was a mountainside, actually. And we got up to the top, and of course, the first thing you got to do is sit down and catch your breath and maybe take a drink of water. And I looked down at the ground between my feet, and there was this perfectly preserved fossilized fern. And it was just so gorgeous, and it would have looked really nice in my house. And I just looked at it, enjoyed it, and turned it upside down. So if somebody else came to that location, they might not be tempted to take it home and put it on their mantelpiece. I heard maybe this is an anecdote that wasn't true, but that once upon a time and maybe still today at Petrified Forest, somebody's watching to see if visitors take petrified wood.
Well, I think that um, yes and no. Of course, there are rangers that are patrolling and they're keeping their eyes open for any sort of inappropriate activity. But I think that there really isn't there really isn't a presence that out there secretively watching visitors at any particular time.
All right, had to check that one. Fact check it. Now, as I mentioned, I went out to Agate Fossil Beds National Monument last year. Beautiful place in western Nebraska, and two large mounds, as it were, where a lot of the discoveries were made back in. Oh, you probably got a better date from me than I do. I think it was late 1800s, early 1900s. And the park has walkways that you can go around where they discovered a lot of the fossilized remains there. I believe there are other places in agate fossil beds that are closed to the public where there is ongoing research. And I have to wonder, with only 12 paleontologists across the system, you probably rely a lot on university research to help you go through the parks and find out exactly what's there.
Absolutely, and in fact, the National Park Service Paleontology Program um, has a memorandum of understanding and agreements with the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology and the Paleontological Society. Those are the two largest professional paleontological organizations in North America, where they're specifically designed to seek support and assistance with technical assistance matters where we need consultation from a specialist who may understand fossil ferns or fossil shark's teeth or whatever their specialty is and help us to try to answer questions, whether they're scientific questions or they're questions related to the management protection of these non renewable fossils in parks.
And a lot of those partnerships really pay off, and they really bring in a lot of different experts in the field. And you look at what you guys discovered at White Sands National Park down in southern New Mexico, the fossilized footprints, which told a bunch of stories in themselves, but then there were also, I believe, fossilized sloth footprints and some other creatures.
Absolutely. So that's an incredible story, and the story begins about 15 years ago when a young new natural resource specialist by the name of David Bustos came on board at White Sands, and of course he picked up on all the good work of previous staff, and he was out looking at air photos and watching how these white sand dunes were drifting over time. But David observed something that others really didn't look at, and that was he looked at the underlying playa lake deposits that are beneath the shifting sand dunes. So when the sand dunes move, they expose these ice age shallow lake deposits called playa lakes. And he immediately noticed that there were features in them that looked like footprints of mammals. And so I had never spoken to David, but I received an email from him and he said, "Hey, can I send you some photos?" And of course, when I saw those photos, it certainly changed my life in terms of saying, I'm coming down there as soon as I can. It looks like you definitely have mammoth and camel and cat tracks that are likely from the Pleistocene because, the age of these lake deposits are of that time period. And so since that time, we've brought in an international team of experts to be able to evaluate these resources. We were able to fly drones to get aerial videography and photographs in some of the most restricted airspace outside of the White Sands Missile Range to be able to document. And we confirmed through that process that there are not just lots of tracks at White Sands. There are tens of thousands, and we refer to the area as a mega track site, a very rich, probably one of the richest ice age fossil track site known anywhere in North America, maybe the world. And the information that is revealed to us has just been extraordinary. And so, what complicated the matter for us is that we're paleontologists and we know our limits. that when we began to find these footprints that look like human footprints, we got really worried because, of course, to the archaeological community, their paradigm is that humans didn't exist in the New World until, maybe 13,000 years ago. And if we're finding evidence of human footprints in co occurrence with Ice Age mammals that may be older than that, we're going to get ourselves in trouble with the archaeological community. But we brought the right team in. We've presented this information. We've published it in peer-reviewed journals, including Science and Nature. We got a lot of pushback initially, but we really feel that the science that has gone forth with very rigorous peer review has pushed back that paradigm of humans almost 10,000 years earlier in terms of the occurrence of humans and the antiquity of humans in the New World back to between about 21 and 23,000 years ago. And what's cool about that time frame is that that's the area called the last glacial maximum. That's the area where the ice ages and the extension of the ice sheets were at their maximum at the coming towards the end of the Pleistocene. There are probably new information that's going to come from continued research. That stay tuned. That there'll be more to be shared in the near future. I did want to say one quick thing that we're very proud of is that there were a lot of archaeologists that just really criticized, the first time that we reported these very early dates because it's contrary to every textbook that they had learned from. And one of the individuals who's a well-known archaeologist by the name of Vance Haynes, he's in his 90s. He taught generations of archaeologists and helped to write textbooks and scientific publications confirming that their belief was that humans didn't exist in the New World prior to about 13,500 years ago. And so he's from that greatest generation of people. He's a very scholarly, polite man. And so when he didn't agree with us, he told us, but he also told us in a very diplomatic way. And he even published some op-eds, saying that, they're doing good research, but they're wrong. After our most recent publication from about a year and a half ago, where we went back and we looked at the really good feedback that we received from the peer reviewers saying, you haven't addressed question A and question B and question C, that the team came together, put on their thinking caps, and really expanded the edge and the limits of new ways to incorporate science into answering these kinds of questions. And when Vance Haynes read that publication, we got an email letter from Vance Haynes. Again, he's in his 90s now. And he said, I dissected your article completely, and I want to tell you, congratulations, you got this one.
Hmm.
And it's like, that letter needs to go, into the National Archives because his word means the world to the archaeological community. And to have, that support from somebody like him was one of the greatest gifts that we received as part of this project.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Now, you said there's a lot of stories yet to come. I can't wait to read about them, hear about them. There were a lot of stories initially with these discoveries about family groups, I believe, traveling across these playas and possible stalking of wildlife and possible wildlife stalking of family groups. What can you say about that?
Yeah. So the research team, again, that includes an international group of specialists, began to document these very long human trackways. One is 1.5 kilometers in length. And there's one set of trackways where there were two humans. One was a larger individual based on the dimensions of its footprints, and one was a smaller individual. And they noticed on the tracks of the smaller individual, either a subadult or maybe it was a male and a female, we don't know, we may never know, is that the smaller of the two sets of footprints seemed to have an asymmetry. Then once in a while, it seemed to have a favoritism or shift in its angulation of its footprint to the right, and then eventually it would shift to the left. And they thought maybe this individual was injured or crippled or something like that. In April of 2018, after we had our first press conference on our first publication that we published about the fossil tracks at White Sands, is that we went back out into the field and they showed us this very long trackway, and then we all got on our hands and knees and continued to try to document, excavate, clean out some of these tracks. And that day, another day I'll never forget, is that I was down there cleaning the tracks, and I came upon a track that was just a couple of inches. And the more that I cleaned it, the more that it reminded me of my granddaughter, who was 3 years old, Lily, her foot. And I was holding my breath and I'm thinking, I can't be looking at an ice age human footprint. And so I waited until I really got it cleaned out before I embarrassed myself and invited others to look at it. And when they came over, they all simultaneously said, "There's a baby." And so it was at a part of that those trackways with the larger trackway and the smaller trackway, the one with asymmetry, where we hypothesized is that perhaps the smaller footprints were of a person that was carrying a baby on their hip and then shifting that baby back and forth over time, perhaps causing the asymmetry. Now, we'll never be able to prove that, but to sit there and to contemplate these things about these moments in time where these human interactions occurred with Pleistocene megafauna is remarkable. And of course, something that the Park Service has been very good about is making sure that the local Native American groups in New Mexico have been invited to come in and see. They're extremely curious, of course. This is their heritage, and so David Bustos, when he was debriefing us after one of the visits by the Native Americans, he said that when we showed them the footprints and we showed them the toddler footprints, he said, "You know what they said to us? Not a word. It was the tears that came from their eyes that expressed their views on the importance." And of course, they've been very complimentary to the Park Service because we've helped them to understand things that they believed and understand all along, and helping to preserve part of their cultural heritage.
Yeah. Well, has the Park Service been able to build some boardwalks so the general public can see those footprints, or is that still to come?
So that is all in the planning and discussion of a park. You know, I don't know if you were aware that what was White Sands National Monument 10 years ago was actually redesignated as a national park during all of this discussion.
Right.
If you look at the language in the enabling legislation designating the national park, White Sands National Park, they include part of the significance is the important paleontological and archaeological resources. So we're very proud of that. But the park, has lots of issues, and they don't have a large staff and a large budget, but they're trying to put forth proposals and planning to be able to develop visitor experiences so that they'll be able to experience these resources firsthand.
Yeah, no, that'll be exciting to be able to see those in person up close. Now, National Fossil Day coming up in October, October 16th. As I mentioned earlier, there really is no shortage of parks that folks can head to mark and celebrate that day. One of the interesting ones I find, we mentioned it earlier, Fossil Butte National Monument in southwestern Wyoming. And the interesting thing about that is not only can you take some ranger guided tours out across the landscape and see where these fossils came from, but the visitor there is just gorgeous, and it's got some incredible finds. But you can also observe fossil preparers at work with their demo
Absolutely.
picks.
Yeah, Fossil Butte is one of the parks I had the good fortune of working at. I was the chief ranger and acting superintendent there. And one of the things we were really proud of is although we probably only had 29,000 visitors per year, we're a remote area. that a lot of those people were coming there for a reason. They wanted to see this resource. And the one thing that we were really proud of that we were able to share with them that the Smithsonian never could do is the fact that we had on display in the visitor center this very rare, fragile fossil bat. Think about the bones of a bat. We have a completely articulated bat skeleton that's preserved in these ancient lake deposits. The remains of bats are very fragile. Their bones are quite fragile. And so there's not a good fossil record of bats outside of ice age occurrences of bat bones that are found within caves. But here we are 50 million years ago, where we have these lake deposits where there is very fine sedimentation of silt material that allows for very detailed preservation of these organisms. And because it's very quiet water, low energy, and not a lot of wave action, things like that, that complete skeletons can be buried rapidly and remain to be articulated when they're discovered. So here we have, in a very poor fossil record of bats, 50 million years ago, we have a glimpse in being able to see what they look like. And so visitors coming in to Fossil Butte National Monument Visitor Center had the opportunity to take a look at a bat, very rare specimen. There's more T-Rexes out there than these very rare fossil bats. And we can take them out the door and show them the beds that they were preserved, so they can make that connection between the environments where they were preserved, the processes of paleontology to extract them and collect them and to prepare them. They don't have that same opportunity at the Smithsonian. I don't care how cool their fossils are. We had the opportunity to share this fossil bat story and its long-term story of how it was preserved and discovered.
And while Fossil Butte is somewhat remote, I spent 9 years in eastern Wyoming, and I never made it out to Fossil Butte until I moved to Utah. It is on the way to Grand Teton National Park and Yellowstone National Park, or to Rocky Mountain National Park, depending on your drive. And you can just head off and visit Fossil Butte on the way to one of those parks or on the way home from one of those parks. It really is a fascinating little gem that a lot of people don't know about in the national park system. Well, Vince, it's been great catching up with you today. It sounds like there's a lot of wonders out there in the national park system, and a lot of fossil news is coming out, and we're looking to hear more about some of the research that's going on out across the parks.
Thanks so much, Kurt. I really appreciate you helping to share our story about fossils in the national parks and National Fossil Day. And so I'll look forward to chatting with you again.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it interesting. While National Fossil Day isn't until mid-October, you don't need to wait until then to enjoy parks with fossil histories. To find a list of those 286 park units known to have fossils, visit nps.gov/subjects/fossil-parks-list.htm. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchak. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.